Alright, here goes. Part 2 of The Sexual Steward. Further, as poverty came to be seen as through a less sympathetic lens in the news, it was increasingly associated with blackness, undeservingness, and laziness. Over the next decade, these images of the black, undeserving poor coalesced around the images of single motherhood, closely associated with Ronald Reagan's fictional model of the welfare queen, the woman who gained the system whose children were produced as a strategy to drain state resources and put cash payments into the pockets of women who did not work. The idea of blacks as inherently poor and undeserving, and of black women in particular as continually reproducing a race of resource draining children, was central to the policing of black women's bodies in the second half of the 20th century, particularly the coercive sterilization of women of color in the US. Yet, simplified images of conditions in the Global South remain central to the visual narratives of development, tugging at the heartstrings of audiences in the Global North, who project their own values into the difference rendered in these images. This visual imagery is central to producing and maintaining ideas of sexual stewardship. As Chandra Mohanty famously described the homogeneous universal Global South woman in these and similar images, quote, leads an essential truncated life based on her feminine gender. Sorry, lots of cars going by. Alright. Leads an essentially truncated life based on her feminine gender, read sexually constrained, and her being third world, read ignorant, poor, uneducated, traditional, tradition bound, domestic, family oriented, victimized, etc. In contrast to the implicit self representation of Western women as educated, as modern, as having control over their own bodies and sexualities and the freedom to make their own decisions. Sexual stewardship discourses are similar. Global South women are presented as the homogeneous poor, simultaneously burdened by environmental problems, poverty, and their own excess fertility. These representations trap them in a static, unchanging narrative of victimhood and vulnerability that contrasts with the potential for assumed agency through reproductive self management. This model, which depoliticizes and historicizes poverty, gender equality, and environmental problems, is the basic recipe for sexual stewardship. This book is written as a cautionary tale against the ways contraceptives and family planning are taken up for advocacy in international development by environmental activists. I argue that advocacy strategies that problematize global population growth as an environmental and climate problem and contraceptives as a solution are often simplistic and do more harm than good. While family planning advocacy is the laudable goal that needs more support and increased funding, the narratives that have been used by the Sierra Club and their patterns have produced problematic ideas about demographic change as a driver of environmental problems in ways that obscure social, political, and economic causes. They rest on a apolitical ecology, end quote, approach that says environmental problems are caused by forces such as individuals' poor choices and by demographic changes, including population growth. This approach leaves no room for understanding structural, political, and economic drivers of environmental change, and in obscuring these forces threaten to undermine the very goals of populationist claims. Sorry, my phone was going off. Populationist claim to hold dear social and ecological justice and bodily autonomy for poor women in the global south. Apolitical ecology approaches have long been at the heart of struggles to make sense of environmental problems and have been central to the history of populationism and population control. Denaturalizing environmental problems. A key argument of this book is that population and environment discourses and logics persist in international development due to the enduring power of Malthusianism. Yet, Malthusian logic has been thoroughly criticized or critiqued, many would say debunked, by critical scholars and activists for decades now. Many of the most trenchant critiques of Malthusianism have been offered by scholars of political ecology for the past 40 or so years, combining, quote, the concerns of ecology and broadly defined political economy, end quote, political ecologists have rejected simplistic biological demographic and other apolitical framings of problems like deforestation, soil erosion, and climate change. Instead, rooting these problems in unequal social, political, and economic systems. Beginning in the 1970s, Marxist political ecology writers have analyzed the role of class and capitalism in Malthusian logic. Harvey, for example, Harvey, okay, argued that the concept of nature and natural resources are not fixed, but rather are constructed socially through capitalist systems that align them value. Resource scarcity, then, did not arise from biological conditions of overpopulation or human overconsumption, but instead from outcomes of any inequitable distribution of wealth. Well, obviously, at the same time, it's possible that someone in a small location can use up the last of a berries in a bush or something in nature, but that's not the same as somebody going out of their way to make sure you can't eat while you lock all the rest of the food up in a dumpster somewhere. So that's pretty true. Okay. Studies of local and regional famine events demonstrate that international markets and capitalist systems of production, not overpopulation, have produced entrenched hunger and poverty at the local level. For example, Davis's analysis of 19th century regional famine events found that these famines, long constructed in neo-Malthusian scholarship and media accounts as the result of local population and sustainable cultivation practices, were actually the result of both of El Nino weather patterns that shaped long-term trends in soil fertility, as well as introduction of colonialism and capitalism in global south countries. The resulting entrenched poverty and maldistribution of food resources based on deep political economic equalities of colonialism manifested in widespread starvation at national and international scales. Political ecologists have also critically interrogated knowledge production itself, specifically the way scientists make and cultivate para, para, paradigmatic ideas about environmental change. Fairhead and Leach's sharp analysis of degradation narratives describing Gunnian forest and savanna landscapes details the ways ecological scientists and policymakers literally saw population driven deforestation when it did not exist. By misleading islands of dense forest cover in broader savanna wildlands as evidence of deforestation, when in fact they exemplified afforested landscapes restored by local communities. The scientists, presented with data counter to neo-Malthusian narratives go deeply embedded throughout the ecological sciences, had no other framework through which to hold on. Had no other framework through which to interpret and explain what they were seeing and thus produced decades of erroneous results. In a similar vein, Giroux's historian study of deforestation in Madagascar demonstrates that, counter to the prevailing arguments, the dramatic loss of forest cover across the island was driven by colonial policies favoring market-based production of forest commodities rather than population growth. In favor, her research found that under colonial rule, forest loss was intensified during periods of population decline in the country's eastern rainforest corridor. Numerous studies have demonstrated that the intersection of population control program and rural development schemes have resulted in the intensification of local poverty, land dispossession, and few, if any, impacts on fertility trends. Ecological problems and the solutions that are devised to respond to them do not simply exist in the world of their own accord. Rather, they are constructed by assemblages of actors and knowledge practices. Hager illuminates this through his analysis of discourse coalitions. Discourses, or, quote, assemblies of ideas, concepts, and categories through which meaning is given to phenomena, end quote, provide the tools for constructing problems as well as providing the context in which problems are understood. Um, a discourse coalition comprised of actors who share a given social construct then takes these up, using persuasion or force to convince others to accept their interpretation of reality. When specific problems are discussed, discourses are presented as particular narratives or storylines. The complexities of the various narratives are concealed as they are assembled into a coherent whole. Policymaking is similarly discursive. It is not just about problem solving, but rather about problem creation. This does not deny material reality, but rather argues that environmental problems, for example, cannot be understood without analyzing the discursive practices through which we perceive reality and the options available for intervening on it. Hold on, car. Alright. Further discourse coalitions function as advocacy networks. These networks provide non traditional actors the ability to mobilize information strategically and transform the terms of policy debate in ways that influence more powerful institutions. Thinking through these issues with respect to population and reproduction necessitates an analysis of questions of gender and its attendant roles, norms, expectations, and inequalities, all of which impact environmental discourses, policies, rights, and access to resources. Feminist political ecologists have long argued that experiences, interests, and responsibilities for nature and environment are often constructed along the lines of gender inequality, a and mediated by race, culture, and gender. Their network demonstrates that gender operates as a critical variable in shaping a resource access and control, interacting with other social categories such as race, class, culture, and ethnicity to shape processes of ecological change. Struggles to sustain ecologically viable livelihoods and sustainable development. However, feminist political ecology does not simply add another category, gender, to political economic analysis of environmental change. Rather, it also addresses questions of identity and difference and how multiple forms of meaning are made in relation to environment, struggle, and change. Moreover, feminist political ecology rejects the essentialist narratives common in gender, environment, and development scholarships of 1980s that posit women's relationships to nature and the environment as homogeneous, static, and universal. Gendered social roles shape environmental practices, policies, and their impacts, manifesting as unequal norms, burdens, expectations, and blame narratives. That is so true. Um, Blame narratives. That's an interesting thing to mention, actually. Women's employment in formal and informal sectors, roles within environmental justice organizing and other social movements, and centrality to smallholder farming, a traditional medicine gathering, and water and fuel collection have all pos- positioned women within close proximity to nature. This is not based on natural affinity for or inherent closeness to nature, but rather the demands, expectations, constraints, and opportunities shaped by social norms and expectations. While much of the literature on gender and environment is focused on the global south, feminists have also analyzed these relations in the global north, particularly with respect to how social norms impact household resource consumption and use. For example, when researchers and policymakers focus on green duty lifestyle changes, encouraging consumers to reduce resource consumption, to use green products, and to educate themselves about the impacts of everyday household products, these efforts fall heavily on women's shoulders. An enduring life, an enduring life, oh, sorry, an enduring storyline of gender and environment shape has predominated in environmental policymaking for decades. In this storyline, women are vulnerable victims subject to the harsh impacts of environmental change based on an assumed close relationship to nature. At the same time, development projects characterize women as particularly resourceful and able to adapt to environmental changes. Thus, a second image arises, that of the resilient and responsible actor, well poised to take matters into their own hands to turn environmental problems into environmental solutions. This narrative of closer to nature, victim, and potential agent of change has characterized much of the environmental thinking on women in the environment and development sector. This almost brings me back to like hearing like the sacred femininity from like certain religions, and like that is just a purely an expectation. All right. I really forgot where I was. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay. Um, resur- Resurrection posits these enduring storylines, or persistent woman environment linkages, as an important historical means for women to secure a seat at the table in terms of environmental policy making. In order to play a role or have their concerns recognized at all, women historically have to simplify and adopt essentialized representations. However, these narratives are also detrimental. They cast women in narrow, homogeneous roles that offer little room for for diversity, historical contingency, or innovation. They also erase men and therefore gender itself as a relational condition of social inequality from the picture. In so doing, these representations depict woman's condition as static and unchanging, thus naturalizing vulnerability rather than rooting it in social relations. Ironically, the images of victim and agent arose from efforts to better understand women's particular roles in environmental management in the global south. In the early 1970s, development debates arose around the linkages between women, environment, and development, or WED, and focused on addressing all women's interrelations with the environment in the quote, all women's interrelations with the environment in the context of economic developments as well as effects that environmental degradation has upon women's lives, end quote, including increased subsistence household labor, water and fuel collection, effects of pollution of air, water, and soil, and increased workplace exposure to toxins. Braidotti et al. Locate the emergence of WED debates in forestry, specifically fuelwood energy, and agriculture circles in early questions about fuel and water use, and women's role as collectors of natural resources for household consumption. Women began to be framed as unique victims of energy and environmental crisis, and the category of woman in this category began to be used interchangeably with the poor. At the same time, international development circles began to focus on women's grassroots environmental activism in the global south, concentrating on Chipko movement in India and the Green Belt movement in Kenya as examples of women's particular role as protector of the environment. However, the broader engagements with women's roles in and relationships to development extend far beyond questions of the environment and natural resources. They range back to the early days of the U.S. involvement in international development intervention and shape how women, gender, and gender relations have been conceptualized and made into development intervention strategies. Entangling women, gender, and empowerment in development. Women in development WID strategies were created in the 1970s in an effort to integrate women into existing international development initiatives focused on the political, economic, and social sectors. Following Esther Boserup's groundbreaking work on the sexual division of labor in agrarian communities, women development practitioners in Washington, D.C. were concerned with ensuring that women would be better integrated into local economic structures in the global south. Their perspectives were informed by and closely associated with modernization theory, the paradigm that dominated international development from 1950 to the 1970s, and focused on technological fixes such as technology transfer, market based skills, and the development of technologies to increase or better marketize women's workload. Feminist critics of WID approaches charged that they were based on an acceptance of existing unequal social, political, and economic structures and avoided questioning the reasons for women's subordination. They are focused on women as a singular and homogeneous group, thus obscuring the role of unequal relations with men, as well as the importance of race, class, ethnicity, and religion in shaping women's life conditions. I think this is true in terms of how I've seen research and talked about uh, women in general as in terms of the situations they're in currently. Um, I think it's true that people often talk about them in terms of victimhood. But this is just the wedge issue of how we think of women, I imagine. This is why they're used as victimized objects and used as victory over men in terms of feminism sometimes. Like, you can spin propaganda about women how you want, I guess. Anyways, um, forgot where I was again. Okay. Given that WIT programs were primarily focused on how to integrate women into existing development initiatives, another central assumption was that women were not already participating in development programs, which was far from the case. In fact, women were first included in international development in 1950s and 1960s through the focus on the reproductive roles in the household via programs and policies addressing food aid, malnutrition, and family planning. The approach primarily focused on women's roles as mothers with underlying rationale of social welfare. International economic aid prioritized male dominated industries in the formal sector, while welfare for the family targeted women. This welfare approach was based on three assumptions. First, that women are passive recipients of development. Second, that motherhood is the most important role in women's lives. And third, that raising children is the most effective role for women economically. In other words, women's primarily roles and contributions were assumed to be reproductive while men's roles were productive. As Moser argues, quote, intrinsically welfare programs identify women rather than lack of resources as the problem and place the solution to family welfare in their hands without questioning their natural roles, end quote. Over time, the development program managers argued that the competitive free market was a better venue for maximizing women's potential for opportunities for self improvement. As a result, women's roles as economic agents, micro entrepreneurs, farmers, factory workers were increasingly recognized as essential to integrating women into development. In the early 1980s, feminists mounted a formal response to the embedded power relations, inaccurate assumptions of WID programs under the banner of Gender and Development (GAD). Approaches addressed not only women, but women in relation to men and how gender relations are socially constructed within a contingent context of space and time. In a GAD approach, both productions and reproduction are socially constructed and both create the conditions of women's subordination. Thus, social, economic, and political life are sites for questioning and critiquing the roots of women's subordination in the context of socially constructed gender roles. GAD proponents were particularly concerned with integrating these critiques in development approaches, arguing that women were active participants in development from the beginning, operating as agents of change rather than passive recipients of outside interventions. A central concern within GAD is the question of power, how it operates, circulates, and is embedded in development. Empowerment is central to these concerns, particularly transforming power relations within development. GAD proponents have developed multiple ways of thinking about empowerment as a resource to transform uh, interventionist models from a grassroots bottom-up perspective, as well as altering understandings of what power is, how it operates, and how it can be harnessed and transformed. For example, Kabir identifies three ways of thinking through empowerment. Quote, the power to affects outcomes over and above the wishes of others. Power over refers to procedures that benefit certain groups at the expense of others, and power with focuses on building solidarity and alliances with others. Sen and Watulwala extend these orientations in multiple directions, defining empowerment as the ability to mobilize resources and to determine the rules of the game in ways that mask the workings of inequality, as a quote process of changing power relations in favor of those at the lower levels of the hierarchy, end quote, and as control of both material resources and ideology. Sen and Ground, however, insist that women's empowerment must be an explicitly feminist enterprise that responds to the needs and priorities of multiple kinds of women, and that is defined by them for themselves. Emphasis in the original. Their version of empowerment within development prioritizes strategies to meet human needs as well as transforming access to and control over economic and political power. In this model, improved living conditions, socially responsible resource use, and the elimination of gender subordination and socioeconomic inequality are linked sites of struggle and necessary transformation. However, as Halfon's analysis demonstrates, development institutions are generally not organized around grassroots work and tend to function in a more top down structure. They also emphasize program efficiency based on short term, easily measured goals. Feminist empowerment models are rooted in radical grassroots political change, which does not fit easily with the kinds of bureaucratization and hierarchy found in many development institutions. Um, well, you still need conveyor belts and like mass movement of objects to to be global. So feminism would still need like bureaucracy, unfortunately. Depending on how you look at it, it's still a necessity, even if you don't want to have. It doesn't even need the corrupt angle to talk about how necessary bureaucracy is. All right. In the context of population, many NGOs narrow their focus to reproductive decision making as the center of empowerment, likely because this approach serves as discursive link between traditional populationist programs. Sorry, I forgot where I was. Totally in my own zone right now. Populationist groups and women's rights advocates as empowerment became incorporated into population policy in the 1990s. It was translated from the political approach to social transformation into a set of policy strategies. This translation effort has diluted it, its radical framing in favor of efficiency and achievement of development program goals. Ironically, this is why the very kind of approach the empowerment model was designed to critique and resist. Halfon describes the process of dilution thus, quote, the meaning of women's empowerment has become defined through the practices and discourses of population institutions rather than strictly through feminist and radical theorizing. Because of the looseness of its definition, its reinterpretation through existing policy goals and planning strategies, and the constraints posed on uh, institutional and professional needs, empowerment oriented projects often resemble the development frameworks they were originally conceived and opposition to do. As I argue throughout this book, the empowerment has become such a loose term that it is rather far afield of its original intent. Today, in population circles and in development discourse more broadly, empowerment is often, quote, used in a way that robs it of any political meaning, sometimes as no more than a substitute word for integration or participation in processes whose main parameters have already been set out elsewhere. Sex, population, and science in development. As Foucault has argued, population became an economic and political program requiring state level management and surveillance in the 18th century. This was not the problem to be solved through elimination, but rather one to be managed and governed in order to optimize the capacities of populations. Techniques such as statistical data collection, public health surveillance, collection of information on birth and death rates, fertility, life expectancy, and health and illness status came to operate as an opportunity for state authorities to direct the sexual energy of populations, serving as a point of entry for ever increasing intervention into the most intimate spheres of family life. This stuff can't just be for population management and fertility manipulation. My guess it's just like good to know once your society grows that huge. You want to know what's going on. So obviously, it's up for grabs for population management and surveillance. Obviously, okay. Um, Sexual and reproductive health interventions, including family planning, population control, and policies designed to increase birth rates have all come to be managed in this way over time. Sex and sexuality, reproduction, and lifestyle are objects of study and intervention precisely because of the power relations governing knowledge, production, surveillance, and management of population bodies that make it possible as such objects. And the knowledge and discourses of sex and reproduction are deeply invested in questions of power, authority, and sovereignty. Discourse operates as a vehicle for the consolidation of power based on the management of body, sex, and reproduction. Ideas of nation state and progress have been tied directly to sexual conduct and reproduction through science, modernization, and capitalism, and development interventions, particularly in the arenas of sex and reproduction, operate as vehicles for such objects. As sexuality has historically been transformed into an object of scientific and medical study and intervention, sexual and reproductive health development programs have advanced notions of what it means to be modern in one's sexual and reproductive behavior. Such programs make possible new forms of governance in which bodies and health become sites for control, management, surveillance, and dominance. In this context, sex operates as a moral object as well as a site around uh, which projects of standardization, universalization, and scientific transformation are organized. In the context of development, sex is simultaneously rendered a moral object, an object of scientific knowledge production, and a site for expanding nation or notions of progress and modernity. Um, Population advocates in the development area have long been in a constant quest for the more scientific data to prove the link between population growth and environmental change, to demonstrate that their advocacy is driven by factual, unbiased science. The idiom of co-production, conceptualized by Jasanoff, is particularly illuminating here. Jasanoff argues that, quote, the realities of human experience emerge as the joint achievements of scientific, technical, and social enterprise. Science and society, in a word, are co-produced, such each underwriting the other's existence. Standing on the arms of giants, as they say, right? Okay. Co-production arises from the recognition that, quote, the production of order in nature and society has to be discussed in an idiom and does not, even accidentally and without intent, give primacy to either, end quote, and as a result is reflective of a, quote, self-conscious desire to avoid both social and Techno-scientific determinism. Science and technology studies accounts of the world. It does not conceptualize truth and power as preformed entities that oppose each other, but rather argues that scientific knowledge and political orders, quote, shape, entail, and refer to each other, end quote. Well, yes, there's a relationship, obviously. Okay. These are also powerful processes. The ability to produce, shape, and circulate knowledge is deeply linked to notions of authority and expertise, the hidden practices of which co-productionist analysis helped to expose. While population environment advocacy has been grounded by enduring Malthusian ideologies, shifting political climates have forced the development of new discourses, frameworks, and ideological approaches. Analyzing the relationship between the science and politics helps account for these shifts, even as population sciences continue to proliferate. One of the key aims of this project is to explore the political context of scientific knowledge production around population and the environment. This is not to rehearse debates about the role of objectivity in science, but rather to demonstrate the social and political context within which scientific knowledge is produced, and within which it continues to be deeply entangled. In investigating these questions, I aim for this project to serve as a corrective to ideas that naturalize relationships between population growth and environmental problems as fixed, linear, and apolitical reflections of the material world. Alright, methodological entanglements. My research initially began with an exploration of the institutional politics of environmental non-government organizations, NGOs, working at the intersections of global population, environment, and sexual and reproductive health in international development. The ENGOs that have been active in this arena include the Sierra Club as well as the National Audubon Society, World Watch Institute, Worldwide Fund for Nature Conservation, International and Population Conference, formerly known as Zero Population Growth. Despite the fact that the organization's name is population focused, a senior manager described it in an interview as an environmental organization. Most of these organizations employ small staff, often designating one employee to serve as their population person, responsible for informing NGO members about global population trends, tracking U.S. legislation on international family planning, participating in congressional lobbying and other policy advocacy, presenting their work at conferences, and, when possible, joining other members of the Population Advocacy Network for activities. Over time, I realized that population advocacy at these institutions is constituted by relations within a network of similarly engaged actors, from individual donors to community and campus activists. As a result, my ethnographic lens was retrained from the focus on NGOs to a focus on network itself, studying how youth activists came to be so deeply imbricated within it that they see its aims and priorities as their own. A key aim of this book is to track the practices throughout which youth and others in the network deploy political strategy and scientific knowledge on global population growth and environmental change to produce, circulate, and ground new modes of policy advocacy. These practices are far from static in their development. Rather, they are a result of the careful and persistent efforts to network members whose view sorry. Rather, they are the result of the careful and persistent effort of network members who view population interventions as necessary to ensure environmental sustainability at local and global scales. Throughout this book, I refer to this group alternatively as population environment advocates, or simply population advocates. Through interviews and participant observation with youth and other advocates, NGO population program managers, and donors. I sought to understand the politics and practices of international development policy advocacy from the perspective of those working behind the scenes. One of my goals here is to demonstrate the multiplicity of motivations, goals, ethical positions, and moral frameworks utilized by those in this field of development as they attempt to advance a coherent movement while navigating the thorny terrain of controversy. A secondary goal is to investigate the ways in which knowledge about the body, particularly poor women's bodies and fertility in the global south, is constructed, disseminated, and utilized as a basis for political action by a network of actors located at vast geographic, political, cultural, and economic distances from those whose experiences they claim to represent. In other words, I attempt to understand how the other, in this case the universal woman of the scientific data and the social activism, in order to advance an international policy agenda. My research is grounded in three models of data collection: participant observation at population advocacy training, workshops, research presentations, and conference sessions, in depth interviews with members of the network and other activists, and analysis of archival documents. I conducted field work that took place over a 21-month period from April 2009 through December 2010. During this period, I attended a dozen workshops, conferences, training, and research presentations that addressed population growth and environmental change. Of these meetings, most advocated for reducing global population growth in order to promote environmental and climate sustainability. One conference took a distinctly different approach, using a critical race and gender analysis to reject neo-Malthusian arguments in favor of an approach centered on reproductive justice. Many of the population environmental advocacy trainings I attended were focused primarily on enrolling youth activists from campus-based environmental and SRH clubs at colleges and universities around the U.S. These multi-day trainings were primarily led by the Sierra Club in conjunction with a series of SRH and women's advocacy organizations, ranging from the Feminist Majority Foundation to the International Women's Health Coalition, and took place in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco. Attending trainings are also provided the opportunity to conduct in-depth interviews with youth population advocates as well as ENGOs and SRH NGO representatives. Near the end of my field work, I spent 3 weeks in Cancun, Mexico, participating in the International Climate Change Conference, also known as the 16th Annual Conference of Parties of or COP16, and the Association Youth-Led Conference of Youth. Both provided key opportunities to observe how youth activists trained by the Population Environment Advocacy Network operationalize their advocacy training in an international context. Over the course of the project, I conducted formal one-on-one interviews with 64 NGO representatives, donors, community activists, scientists, and scholars. Approximately 20 additional interviews were conducted with feminist activists who critiqued the network's strategies from an intersectional perspective, focused on analyzing race, gender, and class politics of the network's efforts. Finally, I pored over dozens of program reports, project descriptions, funding analysis documents, meeting notes, and funder network reports in report to supplement my ethnographic materials with archival and contemporary documents. My informants were very generous in providing me with these documents as well as sharing private correspondence. On current politics, the stakes of writing a book like this one are high, particularly in the current political movement. As I write this, Donald Trump, a reality television star who has been accused of multiple sexual assaults with Jeffrey Epstein, apparently, who has repeatedly questioned the existence of global warming and who has referred to violent white supremacists as good people, end quote, is President of the United States. In his early days in office, he held the world in limbo for months, refusing to come to a decision about whether the U.S. would remain party to the Paris Agreement, the first legally binding climate change agreement in which all signatories have agreed to work together to limit global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius. He eventually made the decision to withdraw the U.S. from the agreement. Just 2 days after the largest women's march in history, he reinstated the global gag rule, an order that prevents NGOs outside the U.S. from receiving U.S. family planning funding if they provide abortions, or even offer counseling, referrals, or educate clients on obtaining abortions elsewhere. Damn, fucking Comstock over here. Jesus Christ. And this was way before Clarence Thomas started talking about dismantling Roe. Anyways, in a particularly shocking and unprecedented move, at a time of this writing, the Trump administration had just delivered a proposed budget for fiscal year 2018 that eliminated all global health funding for international family planning and reproductive health from over $600 million in 2017 to zero with a stroke of a pen. So he's just allowing rape and people to die from pregnancy and or people to die from illegal background or underground abortions. All right, I can see how this could almost be like genocidal in some way. All right. Given the funding landscape and the realities of Washington politics, population advocacy has become increasingly important from a pragmatic perspective in order to help ensure that women around the world will have access to contraceptives and other reproductive health services. However, a critical feminist corrective to the narratives that sustain this advocacy work is increasingly needed. This book offers this kind of corrective. It interrogates the development and enduring roles of Malthusianism and populationism in ways activists think about and act on. Population and family planning through international development. It centers critiques of race, gender, and class politics in the construction and circulation of populationist framing, and the ways activists link environmental degradation and climate change to human numbers. It also explores the politics of knowledge production and the stakes of the close relationship between science and policy advocacy in creating and sustaining international family planning advocacy effect, efforts. With this said, I have long been and remain a strong advocate for women's voluntary access to contraceptives and other family planning services within the context of comprehensive sexual and reproductive and broader health services. Of course, that just makes sense. Organization of the book. This chapter has led the groundwork for understanding the conceptual questions that this book seeks to address. In Chapter 1, I take up the tumultuous politics of population and development, linking historical controversy and international policy activism with the context of declining donor funding over time and the recent focus on population as a climate problem. I argue that as climate change discourses bring environmental crisis narratives to the forefront of population debates, these narratives open the possibility for new ways of considering reproductive governance and surveillance, and a return to population control. Chapter 2 traces the history of neo-Malthusian thought, exploring how population was constructed as a scientific and environmental problem in the U.S. Over the course of 20th century, as twined with American anxieties over nation geopolitical stability and the global racial balance of power. Chapter 3 explores the science policy interface through an analysis of close relationships between climate population scientists and and their funders. It analyzes the workings of donor advocacy behind the sciences, arguably the most important element in how scientists' models not only project but also produce potential futures. Chapter 4 departs from a focus on knowledge production to interrogate the process through which young activists transform themselves from local policy advocates to self styled development leaders, experts, and social justice actors. Focusing on training workshops, I explore how young people negotiate their own ambivalent subject positions as population advocates, attempting to reframe their role within the language of social justice. Chapter 5 investigates the ways mainstream reproductive health NGOs draw on the language of reproductive justice to frame population advocacy as socially progressive while obscuring the intersectional politics that structure the reproductive justice movement's history and current work. The final chapter concludes the book not by offering solutions, but remaining in a thorny, uncomfortable, and vitally important space, a space of fettering over the future of populationism and its ever clear engagements with gendered neoliberal development discourses. Awesome. Alright. I will be back eventually with chapter 1. You guys can pause the video, obviously, to see the greater context of what I was trying to say if you had a hard time understanding what I was saying. Alright. I'll be back with the next one, guys.